Hi, guys. This is Miss Barr, and we're going to be discussing a little bit about the history that was going on during Harper Lee's life that contributed to this particular book. Now, a couple things to know about the book. One, it was her only book that she published in the very early part of her life. She would publish another book very, very late in her life, and she would come to regret that. But this first book, To Kill a Mockingbird, she always said it never was based on specific incidents in history, but these are the things that influenced her thought process as growing up, and of course had a major influence on the book. Number one, after the states have the war. We have civil war in America. Afterwards, the Union wins, slavery is abolished, and the South still wants to keep a segregated population. In order to do this, they passed what were called the Jim Crow laws. These laws, which were named after a wildly popular minstrel act that was degrading towards African Americans, they put these into place in order to keep races separate. So we end up with rules like this: under no circumstances was a black male to offer to light a cigarette for a white female. The gesture implied intimacy. We have everything from children, of course, of color cannot go to schools with white children. We have white people have to sit in different areas of a restaurant. They have to have different parks. They have to have different restrooms. You cannot sit in a car in the same horizontal seat. So a black person and a white person could not sit next to each other in a car, and that'd be okay. So this led to just ridiculous punishments. A lot of it was done just in order to keep the populations segregated. Now, these are a couple of examples of the signs that were around at the time. This, of course, did not just affect people that were of African or Haitian descent. This also meant any person of color, including in California, quite predominantly the Mexican population. This bottom sign right here actually was in one of the parks here in Turlock, California, up until 1964. Before World War One, and after the Civil War, we have a huge uptick in white supremacy groups such as the KKK or the Ku Klux Klan. It was formed as a secret society. It promoted white supremacy through violence and terrorism. They utilized what was called lynching in order to subdue any person who would come out against white supremacy, anyone who would come out against the Jim Crow laws, anyone that they felt had slighted or disrespected a white person. And this became so common that there's actually a very famous jazz song called Strange Fruit. Go take a look at it. It was banned and panned in America because it was discussing the fact that these people were being killed by these mobs and nothing was being done about it. This particular photo is taken from the Getty's archive. You'll notice the children at the bottom. This is Klan membership was part of a family affair. It was passed down to younger generations and was taught as this was just what you did. After World War One, so we have black military men and women who fought for their country, and then they came home and were again segregated from the rest of the population. And while they were good enough to fight for their country, they were not good enough to eat at a lunch counter with a white person. And this became a huge dividing line. And then the economic struggles of the Great Depression just enforced even harder these ideologies of white supremacy, because now we had a lot of people who had lost their jobs. They had lost what the little status they felt they had in society, and now their only claim to having any kind of social status whatsoever was being white. And so they guarded it rather fiercely. And we're going to see this with the Ewells, Ewells, S. They're a family in the book, and they are there to outline this ideology. Langston Hughes, this is one of his most famous poems. He was writing about how it felt to come back from war and be told you're still not American enough to be given full rights. You don't deserve everything that is given in the Constitution. You are less than. I am a Negro American out to defend my land. I've seen my buddy lying there where he fell. I've watched him dying. I've promised him that I would try to make our land a land where a son can be a man and there would be no Jim Crow birds left in our sky. So, this is what I want to know when we see victories glow. Will you still let old Jim Crow hold me back? Will Dixie lynch me still when I return? And this is wonderful. We have several things that we need to talk about here. We talk about where a son can be a man. It was a insult that any man of color was not called, sir, mister. He was boy. And this was used in order to put him down. And it was something that was done quite often by the establishment. And so that's why he makes this little referenced here. Of course, the Jim Crow birds, we're talking about the Jim Crow laws that were passed. And of course, Victory is Glow is like, after the war is over, after we have won this together, are we still going to be separated? And unfortunately, yes. The Great Depression in the 1930s. The Great Depression hit the South especially hard. We're talking about an industry that is extraordinarily heavily influenced by agriculture, and with a terrible growing season with very little water, we had abject poverty. We could not export goods fast enough or well enough in order to recover. Things were horrifyingly bad. And this just, again, turned people against each other, and they looked for every incident of difference in order to try to make themselves feel superior to another. And it, unfortunately, um, just divided the country again and again and again. Inspiration for the story. Harper Lee was a child when the Scottsboro trials took place in Alabama. These trials were commonly thought to be the inspiration to Kill a Mockingbird, though Lee does deny this. There are some serious threads of similarity and some parallels that cannot be denied. The Scottsboro Boys. On March 25th, 1931, the 9 black young men, as well as several white young men, rode a train illegally. These were hobos. They would jump a train, get to the next county, get to the next city, hope for a better life. Now, the boys got in a fight, and the white boys were kicked off the train. What they got in a fight about is what will cause the biggest social injustice ever committed at this time period. They told the station masters at the next stop that they had been beaten by the black boys. Police arranged to arrest them the next station. They failed to say a couple of things. The next stop, to avoid being punished themselves, Ruby Bates and Victoria Price, both prostitutes, claimed that the black boys raped them. Now, what has been said? Now, I believe it is Ruby actually went on to disappear. Victoria actually recanted her statement and said this, that the white males that were on the train had tried to force themselves upon these young women. And the African American gentlemen that were there, they stopped them and they threw them off the train. Well, at the next stop, when Victoria and Ruby are taken off the train, they have violated Jim Crow laws. They are riding in a train car with someone of another race. The police that time told them, hey, if something happened and you didn't want to be there, but they made you be there, we can kind of overlook this. And to save themselves, Victoria and Ruby decided to lie. Ruby recanted her story. She later said, look, this is what really happened. These guys saved us. We should never have done this to them. But by that time, it was far too late. On March 30th, 1931, all of the Scottsboro Boys were indicted by an all-white jury. This is Ruby and Victoria. Because their parents couldn't afford good lawyers, all were convicted and sentenced to death. Even 13-year-old Roy Wright. Roy Wright was a child at the time, and it did not even matter. They had this also had the same lawyer. The lawyer had already walked into the courtroom with the plan that these guys were going to fry, in his own words. Because Wright's trial was declared a mistrial because Wright never got to see his parents because he was a child and should have been put through the family court system and not the criminal court system. It was declared a mistrial. The cases quickly became famous, causing rallies and riots. It got intense. In November, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned all of the convictions on the grounds that the due process was not followed. These men were not given any legal help. And so, therefore, you got to start again. And at this time, most states would be like, okay, we're just going to let this die and let it go, let them go home. No. State of Alabama decided that they were still going to start new trials 3 years later. So in March of 1933, Alabama continues with their witch hunt. This was really because at the time the governor was going to be reelected, and they had to have this taken care of, and they saw that the only way to get white votes was to make sure that these boys were killed. Now, there was a total of 4 rounds of trials, guys, with appeals. If you guys take a look at the Scottsboro Boys, you please do. You'll actually get to see what happens to them. It's a myriad of sadness, though. Harper Lee was 1926 to 2016. She lived to 90 years old. To add to the complexity of the story, Harper Lee wrote it during a time of great social turbulence in the United States. She wrote the time period in 1920s, 30s, 20s through 30s, sorry. Alabama, but she released it in 1960s Alabama. We're talking about huge changes on the horizon for that small state. In 1950, the winds of change began to blow, and Black Americans were no longer willing to be treated by lesser than human beings. We had the Brown versus the Board of Education, which desegregated schools. The decision engendered feelings of triumph and outrage across the country that had lived under a weight of racial segregation and discrimination for over 100 years. Oh, so sorry, guys. Let me go back. Dink, dink. Ooh, bad. Okay, we had Black citizens across the country began speaking out against oppression, demanding equal rights. A lot of these people had served their country in World War II. They had suffered through the Great Depression with the rest of the population, and they could not understand why they weren't American enough to be granted American civil rights. So the American Civil Rights Movement starts. Rosa Parks. In 1955, after a long day of work, 42-year-old Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat of white man on a Montgomery bus that set off peaceful and violent protests throughout the South. She was not the first one that actually did this. A young woman who was an unmarried mother, she had been kicked off a bus. She worked with Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks just happened to be the second one. She looked like everybody's mom. She was just like the sweetest lady. And they decided that she was a better figurehead than a 17-year-old. And so they utilized her as the speaking point and the figurehead rather than her coworker. Television changes everything. It really, really does. By this time, most families have televisions in their homes. This is a huge, huge thing. Watching the nightly news was a thing families did together. And oh my goodness gracious. At this time, as a person who teaches journalism, has a journalism degree. At this time, newspapers were highly, highly biased. So they really did go along with whatever they were told to go along with, especially in the South. And so the Southern newspapers had really painted the civil rights protesters as being ultra violent and, having to be subdued and having to be put down with dogs and bullets, and because they were so ultra violent that they were going to kill people. Wow, that did not work so great. Because all of a sudden we had news cameras that were portable, and ABC, NBC, CBS News all retrieved footage of peaceful protesters not doing anything wrong, being attacked viciously. And this made it into American television, and we became extraordinarily embarrassed by the behavior, but also we became knowledgeable about the behavior. For the first time, a lot of Americans were like, okay, that's not what's happening. What I'm reading in the newspapers isn't true. And they got to see for the, firsthand what was going on. Martin Luther King, of course, was a civil rights leader that made major changes. Leaders began to rally together, Black Americans, in order to fight oppression for their country and for a country where all men were truly treated as equals. Now, Martin Luther King Jr., of course, was a great orator, extraordinarily powerful speaker, but he also had a reputation as being a man of God. And that really, really, really spoke to a lot of people at the time. And the movement for desegregation began. The national and international call for desegregation in the South rang out. Blacks and whites all over the country started putting pressure on the governments to amend segregation laws. Those individuals, both black and white, who fought in the civil rights were under constant attack from white supremacists who were unwilling to accept Black Americans as equals. Many freedom fighters died for their efforts. There was a group, the Freedom Riders, not WR but RI. The Freedom Riders actually went down to places like Mississippi and Alabama and tried to get African Americans registered to vote, which was almost impossible because we had white supremacists sitting in front of voter registration buildings with shotguns. And these people were like, okay, the reason why there's not a single African American register to vote in your county is because literally you guys are making them afraid to even come and register. Now, the fun fact, guys, this lady right here is still alive. So is this lady. She is part of the Little Rock Nine, who actually went and desegregated a school under much pomp and circumstance. This lady right here, of course, is screaming racial epithets at her and saying horrible things. And now a person in journalism actually tracked her down and wanted to speak to her about what she thought about this particular picture because it's extremely famous. And she admits, I was wrong. I knew no better. To Kill a Mockingbird. In the fall of 1960, in the middle of the civil rights movement, To Kill a Mockingbird was published. It shot to the top of the New York Times bestseller list like a rocket. The country was finally ready to listen to a story of segregation and open their minds to the possibility of an America where whites and blacks could live together as equals. Not only that, Harper Lee made it in the simplest terms. Instead of having a point of view that was an adult point of view, she looked at racism through the lens of a child who had grown up with it as a norm, but who had started to question it because she didn't understand how could they have gotten so far away from their fundamental beliefs that everyone was equal, that everyone was a child of God. So therefore, well, in their mythos, if everyone's a child of God, then everybody's equal. So she's like, well, how can you tell me that they're not? I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So there's this huge gap between what is said and what is done. And she points that out with a blaring spotlight. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you guys have a Flipgrid to do. Now, if you hit the link, there's a couple of questions. I would like you to respond. Thank you very much and have a good day.